Good evening, and welcome to the fifth installment of Let's Talk Science, UC Riverside's College of Natural and Agricultural Sciences virtual event series. My name is Amanda Gomes, CNAS's Senior Associate Director of Development, and I want to thank you for joining us for another virtual conversation. Before we get started with our program, we at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current stakeholders of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. Tonight, please note that only speakers will be heard or seen during tonight's webinar. If any questions come to mind, please submit them in the chat box and they will be answered at the end of the discussion. Today, we will hear from CNAS Dean Kathryn Uhrich and Dr. Tina Hambuch-Hawks, Medical Director of Molecular Genetics at Quest Diagnostics. Dean Uhrich oversees a research and teaching enterprise comprising nearly 1,000 faculty, staff, and researchers, and approximately 8,000 undergraduate and graduate students in 13 academic departments. Dean Uhrich oversees a $100+ million operation and helped raise over $100 million in funding to support CNAS. Currently, CNAS is focused on elevating PhD student support. Dr. Tina Hambuch-Hawks has more than 15 years of experience in commercial, clinical, genetic, and genomic testing laboratories, including UCR Alumna, Invitae, and Quest Diagnostics. Her focus has been on implementing, improving, and establishing best practices for clinical applications of novel, high throughput, next-generation sequencing. In 2009, she launched the first clinical laboratory to offer whole genome sequencing as a clinical test. Her primary focus has been to apply rigorous clinical performance requirements to novel genomic scale technologies. She has authored over 30 publications on clinical applications of next generation sequencing, good laboratory practice and data management, and privacy. She serves currently on working groups for CLIAC, CLSI, ACMG, Genome Canada, Genome BC, and previously on Eurogen and FDA panels. Tina is board certified by the ABMGG in clinical molecular genetics. She is licensed to direct clinical laboratories in all 50 states and in Europe. She currently works as the Medical Director of Molecular Genetics, Research and Development at Quest Diagnostics. Thank you again, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Dean Uhrich.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for joining me, and we're really looking forward to this conversation. As Amanda pointed out, this is the 5th annual event in our series that we host quarterly to highlight our outstanding alumni and engage in discussions about a range of topics, all centering around the sciences. So I've been really looking forward to this conversation, in which we're going to discuss the intersection of science, leadership, and innovation. And also, just as a reminder, for those who are listening, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we'll address them towards the end of our conversation. So I hope that you all enjoy this event with CNAS alumna, Dr. Tina Hambuch-Hawks. So Tina, I would ask you to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to get to be back here, and I always am happy to see the clock tower. So thank you for having that behind you.
Oh, that's of course.
Feels like home.
It is just like home. Well, actually, I was just thinking about this. You were last on campus in November of 2019, where I had asked you to come and you gave a lecture to one of my classes. So a lot has changed in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing about how things are different on campus and how you are developing additional programs and basically overcoming COVID.
Well, there's a lot going on, and we have a great team here on campus that are working on that. But let's start with you. So, I mean, this is probably easy for you, but this is going to be amazing for the rest of the group. Can you please share your education and professional background?
Sure. So as you know, I started as an undergraduate at UC Riverside. I started out as a biomed, and about halfway through, I took a few classes in some non-biomed focused sciences, specifically evolution and genetics. And I also took a philosophy of science class that made me really think maybe there are some other areas beyond medicine that I would be more excited about pursuing. And so after I finished undergraduate school, I took a couple of years off, and I ended up working at a laboratory at UCLA looking at cancer. And spending 2 years in that laboratory, I really just confirmed that I wanted to do science. And so I went for a PhD rather than an MD, and I went to UC Berkeley, where I focused on population genetics. And I had a fantastic time there. After I focused on the genetics of the immune system. So when I finished that, I ended up taking a postdoctoral fellowship at the Centers for Disease Control. So I got to see the sort of pathogen perspective relative to the host genetics. And I spent a few years there. And what I experienced there was just a real love of and satisfaction for getting to do something that had an immediate application. Science is great, and getting to do research is a lot of fun, but it's really satisfying when you get a patient sample and you can figure something out and you know that it has an immediate impact on a patient. And that really grabbed me. So I went back to academia after that, and I actually took a position as an assistant professor at the University of Munich. And I focused on genomics and thinking about genomics at that point. And I spent a few years doing that, but I really never got quite past just how satisfying getting to have an immediate application for my science was. So I eventually left the University of Munich and made my way to industry, and discovered that as a PhD in genetics, I was entering clinical laboratory testing at just the right time, because the technology was just starting to take off and allow us to really look at patient genes in a way that we couldn't have done before, in terms of both having the cost effectiveness to be able to run a test on a individual's gene, the ability to turn that around in time, and the ability to actually have some idea what it meant. So I stayed in industry and just made my way through clinical genetic laboratories, and have been doing that for the last 15 years.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. I have a lot of questions just listening to this. And so for one, it's fascinating that when you're in the biomed program, so in your first couple of years, already you're thinking about genetics, genomics, and you're interested in that. And you ended up, I mean, you're still doing this stuff. I'm wondering, for this audience in particular, can you share what is genetic testing or genomic testing? What does that mean, and what kind of value does that bring?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's changed so much. I mean, the field as it exists today didn't even exist when I was an undergraduate. The kinds of things that we can do today. So I think it's one of those challenging spaces, because it continues to evolve and expand and become more relevant in different areas of medicine. But the things that I tend to focus on are inherited disease. And specifically, I've really focused primarily on these, what we call diagnostic odysseys, which are these cases where we have a strong reason to believe that something genetic is causing the disease, but there's something about the way the patient is presenting that's atypical, it's not obviously one condition or another, or maybe there are many, many genes that are associated with it, and we don't know for sure which one it is or what combination. Sometimes people are unlucky and they have more than one genetic disease. So really evaluating combinations of their genes, sequencing their genes, and then looking at the variants in those genes and evaluating each individual variant to see, do any of these make sense? Is there any evidence that any of these are likely to be actually causing this patient's disease? And then trying to put that puzzle back together again and explain why a patient might have a particular presentation. So that's one end of it. But then it's now being used additionally to do things like sequence somebody's tumor and their normal cells and understand how their cancer is evolving and use that to try to identify molecular targets in drugs that can actually be used to personalize their treatment and individualize their treatment. So it's being used across a broader spectrum of applications all the time from what I had started on and what I have tended to focus on.
It's going to be fascinating to see what's going to happen in another 10 or 20 years from now in this area.
Yeah, I think we're really, the Mendelian stuff, the stuff that I've tended to focus on, where we have single genes that are responsible for a really severe condition, that's the low-hanging fruit. And I think we're just coming to what I think is a plateau of the last 20 years where we really have solved for most of those diseases. When I got into this 15 years ago or so, we understood gene disease relationships for maybe 200 diseases. And now we're up to about 5,000. We've mostly got that area characterized. And I think then the next thing that we're going to start doing is really understanding how multiple genes are really interacting together and helping to use that. Once we get that, I mean, we're starting to get there already, but once we have enough information that we can start applying that in a personalized way to helping people understand their prognoses, helping understand things like why some people have a more severe response to COVID, for example, things like that. So yeah, I think those are the next steps and the reasons why I'm excited for the next 15 or 20 years.
The long COVID, thinking about this.
Yeah.
So I have another follow-up question. So you were at UCR, you went to UCLA, then you went to UC Berkeley. Tell us okay, I think we talked about this before. So I come from the Midwest and then I'm going to an Ivy League school and it kind of blew my mind. I was not sure if I was going to be prepared. Can you share what your experience is? So you're coming from UC Riverside, which is an awesome place, but may not have the same external reputation that some of our other UC campuses. So can you share a little bit about that transition?
Absolutely. Particularly going to Berkeley, I was really nervous going in because I didn't necessarily have the best grades as an undergraduate. I was working part-time and had to pay my own way through. And so I was really, I didn't necessarily have the most stellar track record there. And going into Berkeley, I really was very nervous and a little intimidated because I was going in with students who had come from these top tier universities. And I was really wondering, well, was I prepared enough? Did I have what I needed to be able to be successful here? And without a doubt, I absolutely did. It was really a fantastic experience and a wonderful eye-opener to see just how well prepared I was. And the quality of the education I got was comparable to anything I experienced at Berkeley. And I think in some ways, for me in particular, I had more opportunities going to a smaller school where I got to know some of the professors. I got to take multiple classes with the same professors whom I really enjoyed and got to work with. And I think in a lot of ways that set me up for success in ways that, particularly also coming from a Midwest, more introverted kind of person, I would have had a hard time at a bigger, glitzier school.
Well, we're very proud of you and your accomplishments.
I owe a lot to Riverside. It's a fantastic school. I really feel like a lot of my most enthusiastic discoveries or ideas were really founded on things that I learned at UC Riverside, and some of the professors that I got to work with there are just inspirational.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So how about you? What was your career path? I mean, you mentioned that you were coming from the Midwest and going to Ivy League. That was a challenge for you, but how did you go on to become a dean? What is that like?
That's a good question. Well, so I guess my abbreviated path in the Midwest, coming from North Dakota, where I got my undergraduate degree, moved to the East Coast, got my degree on the East Coast. Then after I got my PhD, actually, I thought that I wanted to go work in industry. So I worked for a place called Bell Laboratories at the time. And after a few months, I realized I made a mistake. That I made a mistake because I loved doing research. I felt it was really productive, but I really missed teaching students. So I view that mistake as really pivotal in my life, because that helped me realize that I want to work in academics, because I like teaching. I like teaching. I like mentoring. It's what brings me great joy out of anything that I do. So with that, I ended up deciding that I was going to leave a very high-paying job at the time and take a position. I did a postdoc so I can get the right training experience, and then took on a position at a state university in New Jersey. That's where I started as an assistant professor and moved along got tenure, got promoted to full professor. And then at some point in time, I just realized I'm really good at building my own group, thinking about my own research. I also had started companies. And so I just realized I felt like I wanted to bring value and go beyond just doing my own research. I mean, sounds so cheesy, but I wanted to help others. So I've learned how to set up a research group. How can I help others develop a research group? Or how can I help others how to do other things? And so then I took on the opportunity as a dean at this other university and really enjoyed it. And then this opportunity came up at CNAS at UCR. And I basically fell in love. I came here for the interview. I read about it. I absolutely fell in love because the mission of UCR is focusing on predominantly first-generation students, which I was, focusing on lower income students, which I was, like you. I worked to put myself through college. And I just thought, the opportunity to give back and do something in a very different fashion in a place that just had all these signals that just really resonated with me. So I ended up here. I've been here for 6 years now. I love it. It's really amazing. I'll just point out, I don't know how I got here. I'm extremely fortunate. Well, I know how I got here, but it's one of those things. It sounds like you take the opportunities that you find are interesting academically or interesting intellectually, but also just really resonate with who I am and what my core is and what my values are. And so again, I couldn't have planned to be where I was. Probably sounds like you. Another question I had is you went to Munich and taught for a while. And yeah. You do all these things, but that gets you to where you are now. Lets you be extraordinarily successful.
That makes sense. That's great.
A long, convoluted path. Actually, so I'm going to ask you another kind of, hopefully not too orthogonal. So, assistant professor at Munich. How is that different? How is doing science different in an international place and doing science here in the United States?
The academic faculty structure is different in that when you're an assistant professor, you have your own research program, but you are also an assistant to the professor. So you are paired with a professor. So he and I taught classes together, and we had complementary research programs, and we went after grants individually, but we also went after grants as a team. So it was nice in that it's a little more of a mentoring system for early faculty than I think it is here, but it also is much more limited. The opportunities are more limited, the funding is more limited. The sort of training programs that are open to students are more limited. So I think it's got some things that are kind of nice about it, but also some drawbacks. I think long-term, the overall opportunities, at least at that point in time, were definitely more limited than they are here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, following up on that, you talk about mentorship. I also have a question about leadership. You know, historically, women in STEM, difficult to be a leader, maybe perceived to be more difficult to be a leader as a woman than as a man. How did you manage this? How did you navigate? I mean, because again, your leader, I hear it as an assistant professor, you're certainly a leader in your field right now. So how did you navigate that? I won't call it the gender gap, but the gender differential.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question. It's a difficult question because I would say early on in my career, things were really easy and straightforward. I mean, I don't feel like I had particularly any specific challenges as a woman going into science, going into graduate school. That really went pretty smoothly. I'd say really I started noticing challenges more when I hit mid-career. If I had not had a husband who was willing to really be incredibly supportive and let me take some sort of career wins, if he had not been willing to help really share and in some time in occasions really shoulder a lot of the childcare, I think it really would have been a completely different experience for me. I have to say having a partner who's really supportive makes a huge difference. I'd say the other place where I really noticed it is in more sort of, I guess, insidious stuff, particularly in industry. One of the places that I worked had an all-male VP group for many years, and it was commented on frequently across multiple people. And what I noticed in that environment is that my male colleagues could, go talk to a VP and say, hey, let's go grab a beer and talk about our ideas. And it's a lot harder to do that kind of thing as a woman and have it mean the same thing as if you're a man. So I think that there's some places like that where I started really noticing, oh, here are where the gaps are. Here's where it's a lot harder, because I think that those social interactions, it is part of how to become a leader. It's not all just about your work and your productivity. That is important, but that is not the only thing that's needed to really get recognition. And it's that ability to promote yourself and sometimes forge those relationships and figure out ways to do that I think women tend to still struggle.
So maybe I can follow up on this. So what do you do as a leader now to embrace inclusivity? I'm listening. So yeah, you had a VP full of one gender. And then I'm thinking of all the studies have been done that showing, look, if you have a more diverse board, you have more diverse employees, that the company is more productive because you're more open to new ideas or different ideas. So now that you're in a leadership position, can you share some of the things that you're working on to ensure that you have a diverse climate?
Yeah, and that is an excellent question, and something that I have to acknowledge is a real challenge in this space, because, for some of running a clinical laboratory, I have to have people that have certain certifications, that have PhDs, that have board training and certification and things like that. And it is hard to find people that are representative of all the diversity in our country that have those certifications. And it is definitely a significant problem. As part of my activity at the American College of Medical Genetics, so not part of my job, we are actively trying to figure out ways to help do more outreach, to do more recruitment, to offer more programs, and really identify folks who might not even be aware that this field exists. When I was an undergraduate, I didn't know this field existed. When I was a PhD student, I didn't know this field existed. It wasn't until much later in my career. And by the time I discovered that it's possible to go back to medical school with a PhD and get this board certification and have this particular role and this particular job, I was married, I had 2 children. It was not an option to just quit everything and go to a fellowship or do a medical training. And I think that there are a lot of people who find themselves in that spot, particularly just because they don't have that opportunity to be exposed. And so really trying to identify some ways to reach out to undergraduates, reach out to graduate students, and make them aware of these kinds of opportunities, particularly at schools that represent more diverse populations. That's the obvious solution, because it's not going to happen at the level where you're waiting for them to already be board certified. You have to get them, you have to reach out and start connecting with people much earlier on. So I think that that's critical. And then, in our laboratories, I am happy to say we do have a lot of people representing a lot of different backgrounds. And so really trying to have social connections, try to foster opportunities for people to really get to know each other, understand each other's backgrounds, really take the time to learn what their interests are and tell them a little bit about these opportunities and how we could support them. Those are the kinds of things I'm doing. It's relatively grassroots in a lot of ways, but I'm always looking for more opportunities. So if there are ways to talk to students at UC Riverside about this more, I would be happy to do that too, and potentially offer internships and things like that. I think that those kinds of opportunities we need to do more of.
Well, so, and actually just being here now is part of this, because you're letting people know what you do and what the opportunities are. So thank you again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I love my career. I feel really glad and lucky to have found it, and I'm always happy to try to give other people any information they want to help them get there too. Going back to you, what about you? What was your greatest challenge as you came into being dean of CNAS? You've been there for 6 years. What have you found to be the most challenging things that you've had to deal with, and what lessons have you learned?
That's a tough question. So probably because we're still in the COVID world, the biggest thing that comes to mind is COVID. It's there's 10 UC campuses. UCR was the only one that really effectively got shut down because by our public health in the county of Riverside, and I'm forgetting the name of the person, but This was very unique, and that was very unique to the city of Riverside, the county of Riverside. Again, about the medical field, about the School of Medicine. We have a dearth of doctors. You don't have adequate hospital beds relative to the number per capita. So what that meant when we hit a certain level, we got shut down. And what that means is that some of my sister campuses, they can continue doing research, they can continue doing some things. We had to go through the process of shutting everything down except for essentials, and then to try to creep it back open again and doing all that in a safe way, which we did in a phenomenal way. We did well because we had a very thoughtful, courageous group of researchers who worked with it across campus in order to try to help set policies. We also had a group of researchers who decided and built a testing facility on campus when it was really expensive to buy these pieces of machine, and everybody was buying it. So we had a handful of people who are really strong in this area looked around. It's like, we're experts in this. We do this quite a bit. And I'll shout out, there's a couple names, have to give them a shout out. Kathy Borkovich and Iskwi Koloshian really were the two leaders of that group that pulled it together. And it's like, we got a testing facility. This is what we need to do. We got to find a place. We got to get the reagents. We got to get the pipettes, just everything that it takes. And I bring this up because I'm thinking about, here's the translation of doing basic science and translational research.
Yeah.
So folks, we weren't working on COVID necessarily. We were working on other types of viruses and virus detection. But you learn you can take those concepts and apply it to this next thing that's coming down the road. So we were able to, through CNAS, really develop the testing facilities and set it up, which is still working on right now. And so they're still testing our students. So it was an extraordinary challenge. What do you do? Again, from starting, it's like, wait a minute, we have equipment that needs to be fed. NMRs, you have to give it helium or nitrogen, liquid nitrogen, animals, insects, plants, all these things that we just can't walk away. I'm a synthetic organic chemist. And so, yeah, I cannot mix things for a while, but that's different than if I was running a mouse colony that's decades old. You can't just walk away and make that, ignore it. So things have to continue. So how do you manage that and close it down in a very safe way and ramp it up in a safe way? So that was a huge challenge, which we did, because we had so many people who were dedicated and willing to move it to the next step. But there's no way around it. It was hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
And then that's about research, but then how do you do the teaching? So what does this mean? So again, phenomenally, within a few days, campus pivoted from in class from March 13th, Friday the 13th, we had in 2020, and then we had spring break, and then the spring quarter started where it was completely online. And we didn't know how long it was going to be. We didn't know, at first it was going to be a couple weeks, then it was going to be a couple months. It's now a couple years. But we've just figured out how to try to manage this best that we can. And it's being inclusive. It is including a lot of people and having a lot of different conversations. And just making sure they're pulling everybody along, and that, we all may not agree, but we all know that we need to move together and make sure that we're as thoughtful as we can be.
Sounds like it's done some amazing things for the faculty in terms of being able to work together at a different level than maybe you had to before. That sounds really not easy, but like a strong growth experience.
That's a nice way of putting it, a growth experience. Well, I'm just thinking, I'm used to, in the olden days where I'd get in front of my organic chemistry class, you have hundreds and hundreds of people out there and you're used to talking. And in a very short period of time, there's no body language, there's nothing, and you have to figure out, how does this Zoom thing work, and how are we going to make connections, and how do I get questions from people? It was just a complete about shift. And it's interesting because over the fall, we started shifting back. So Well, you have teenage boys. So, so in the fall, we predominantly, we'd say overall, it was about 75% of our classes were in person. And there was a lot of classes that were still held remotely. So the big, huge classes, if it was a few hundred people, that was held remotely, but everything else we tried to do as normal as we possibly can, recognizing that we're transitioning, recognizing that vaccines were available, and just recognizing it's time to move forward and move on.
How has that worked for your student population? I mean, you've talked about the fact that UCR is special in that it does have a very diverse population, a lot of people who are first generation. Do you feel like everybody's getting a chance to come back? Has this hit people especially hard? Are there programs that are needed to really support the students as they're coming back and making their way back?
Oh, Tina.
Is that too big of a question?
No, it's a big question, but it's hard. Because I mean, just a couple of days ago, I'm having messages from students who are living in their cars because, you know, if somebody's sick at home and they don't want to stay there and they want to protect them, it is, if you're particularly don't have the financial means, it's a struggle for a lot of people. And actually, it's not just our students, a lot of our staff. And so imagine, again, you and I, we're working, but your hours are shut down, what that could mean, or if you have a family member who's sick, or if you have a family member that you want to avoid, or a family member that you need to take care of, and you're trying to think about school and all this stuff, it is extremely stressful. So I cannot give students enough credit. So faculty are amazing in doing the shift, but I cannot give the students enough credit for those who are making the decision to continue on, better themselves, give themselves and their families a better opportunity with an education, and struggling with the financial issues, how to manage the family or the friends, or how do I keep working, or can I keep working, or what do I do? Just balancing all these things was really hard. So I would say that UCR students, because of who we represent, probably are struggling with it a lot more than some other universities. But nonetheless, I mean, again, our faculty and staff are really amazing, really working to ensure, give the students and everybody as much support as we possibly can. But it's hard because there are limitations.
Yeah, this cohort of students is facing a set of challenges that the rest of us didn't have to deal with, on top of the challenges that the rest of us did deal with. So yeah, they're really, they need a lot of support right now.
So thank you for asking. Now I'm off. I'm steering off in a different direction. I'd like to get back to you. Let's talk about science and your interest in science. So what sparked your interest in science?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a good question. I mean, I think at some level I was always probably somewhat interested in science. I always loved animals. I always thought I wanted to go into medicine. I think what really sparked it, though, I'd say where I really kind of got passionate about it was winter quarter of my third year at UC Riverside.
Very specific.
I don't have a particular day, but I do have that quarter where I just had this confluence of classes that just really all complemented each other so beautifully. I was taking an evolution class. Dr. Resnick was teaching that. I was taking Len Nunny's population genetics class. And then I was taking a philosophy of science class. And somehow that combination just really got me excited about approaching the world with that kind of scientific philosophy, with that thinking about, you make observations, you ask questions, you create hypotheses, and then you test them. And even when you get a wrong answer, even when you have sort of a failed experiment, you can learn from it and you can keep going. And particularly doing that in a way that helps you understand the world around you, how things work. It just completely got me very excited, and I'm happy to say I'm still really excited about it. So yeah, it was that combination of classes that I think really kind of got me going in that direction.
Well, I'm wondering if Professor Nunny and Professor Resnick are here tonight. If not, I'll have to send them a prompt and thank them.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder sometimes if the professors realize just how incredibly impactful they are on us. Dr. Zook should be in that category too. But yeah, there were some professors there who really just completely shaped my thinking. So oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask, yeah, I mean, your description of being a dean and all of the things that you're responsible for and the clear passion that you have for your students and for the faculty, how do you balance your time? How do you manage to have a personal life and run your research and do the science and do the teaching and just all the things that you're driving? It's amazing to me.
I don't. Start with that. I shift. So, I talked about before, I would teach organic chemistry classes of 1,000 people. I don't do that anymore. Now I'll teach, I love teaching. So I'll teach a learning community class, which is, I think almost everybody, we offer the opportunity. If you are a freshman, you're going to come in and you're going to have a class with a professor. So it's usually about 25 people. And so that's what you actually came in a couple of years ago. So it's not the same as teaching a big class, but it's still having that interaction with students. And actually, I'm just thinking, so it's a matter of just scaling. So there are only so many hours a day. Something has to come off your plate. So for me, I realize I still like teaching, so I do a little bit. I still like doing research, but I don't have the big research program that I have. I have 2 people. So just changing the priorities and making sure that I'm balancing that the best I can. I have one more question though I wanted to ask you, and I see that we're coming down on time, so I just want to make sure. I'm interested in linking the genomics, the sequencing part, and we're talking about COVID. And in your introduction, there's a connection there. So it looks like, if I got this right, that you're studying outbreaks and the impact that it has. So can you say a little bit more about that? Again, so from the genomic sequencing, which you said you got interested way back when you're in your 3rd year at UCR, to this is a lot of stuff that you're doing right now.
Yeah. I mean, so I did a postdoc at the Centers for Disease Control. It was amazing and fascinating. And, I was getting to start using genomic or genetic, at least, testing to really try to track outbreaks, to try to understand how diseases become endemic in new regions, strain displacement, and also starting to think about things that are strangely relevant today. I ended up working on smallpox when I was at the Centers for Disease Control. And one of the things that was a big question was, why are certain vaccines likely to be more effective than others? And why are some more likely to cause a more stronger reaction in a host and not? And so those questions were actually a little premature for our technology at that time. But what's wonderful and really exciting today is that we have the right technology in place to really start answering those questions. We can sequence an entire genome of SARS-CoV, and we can understand all the types of variants that particular strain has. And, we can understand how it is evolving over time. We can track all of its mutations, and potentially, and I know that this is happening, this is not research that I'm doing, I'm tracking strains, but I know that there are also researchers who are looking at people with different reactions. Some people don't get sick. Some people seem fine. Some people get very, very sick. What is going on in their genomes relative to the strain that they are infected with that's potentially contributing to these differentiators? And by doing that, really understanding both potential targets for treatment, targets for vaccines, and just more about our own immune systems and how we can manage our health. I mean, I think that it's really an amazing thing that we have the technology in place now to really start understanding these kinds of events in ways that we couldn't have before.
Thank you. Well, Tina, I was just noticing, I was a quick flippant. Professor Nunny is in the audience and he says hello. And if you haven't, he's, to quote him, even way back then, you were one of the students who really made teaching worthwhile.
Wow, that's awfully sweet. Yeah, I'm so glad to know he's still there inspiring more students. I'm sure that a lot of people are excited after his class to go on and study more population genetics. Which it turned out ended up being, I remember when I went off to graduate school and I said, I'm going to study population genetics, my boss at UCLA said, are you crazy? There's no future in that. And it turned out, I'm happy to say, there really is.
Well, thank you both. We have some questions from the audience. We have a question from Sarah. And Sarah says, someone who transferred to this university as a junior, I don't have the traditional research lab experience many undergrads have as those who usually attend the university since being a freshman, and COVID has exacerbated this. Are there any tips you can give us for trying to find research opportunities here at UC Riverside as a junior, third year level students who haven't been able to have any previous experience in research? Great question, Sarah.
Tina, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so Sarah, I didn't start getting to do research until my junior and senior year either. So I was working at other things my freshman and sophomore years. So I think it's not too late. You shouldn't feel like it's too late. I think, target those professors whose classes you're excited about and just go talk to them and see what opportunities are available. In my experience, they're very open to that and they're excited to try to work with you and what you can possibly do, whether that's 20 hours a week or 5 hours a week, they can usually find some way to help you at least get your foot in the door.
I would agree with that. Faculty do love to talk about their science. The other thing that I recommend people do, talk to your TAs when you're taking labs and your discussion, talk to them and just say, hey, you're taking classes here. Who would you recommend? It's another avenue, and to other students who might be doing research too.
Great. We have another question. So for either one of you or both, tell us about your first job and what did you learn there that you couldn't have learned in the classroom?
I don't know if I want to talk about my first job. My very first job was basically, my job was when I was 16 years old, was to make feed for rats. Basically, I would make their meals and I'd have to take these rats and monitor their weight. And at the end of the summer, this was a summer internship that I had way back when I was 16 years old, was to sacrifice the animals and weigh all their organs. Which at the time, this is probably what, but I grew up hunting and fishing, so it wasn't so weird to me. But then in retrospect, it's like, what a weird job for a 16-year-old girl. But I loved it for me because I found that in this job opportunity that I had could really ask questions. I learned what a hypothesis was. So how do you, if you do this, what are the outcomes that you expect? And you can test that hypothesis. And to me, that was just very different than being in a classroom. Because historically, a classroom is somebody sharing you information. You may have some questions, but you don't get that kind of same one-on-one that you get when you're working in somebody's laboratory. So what was your first job, Tina?
Well, my first job was when I was 15 and I was a receptionist at a hair salon. I don't feel like I learned a great deal from that. I think my first job out of college, though, really struck me because that's where I learned how much we still don't know in science. I went into this lab doing research on leukemia, and I had assumed that we understood so much about leukemia. And I was really blown away by how much we don't know and how much room there is for discovery still in the world.
The more we know, the more questions that we have.
Yeah.
Thank you both. We have a question from Russell. In terms of major, do you think it matters what you major in if you want to focus in genetics as well? He's planning to get a PhD with a genetic focus. For context, he's a cell, molecular, and developmental biology major, but some of his upperclassmen friends say that biochemistry is where it's at in terms of major. What do you think?
I think you should do what you like. I think you should stick with the major that you find most interesting and most exciting. I feel like that has served me well.
I would give the same advice. I would agree, because if you can do things for other people or what they expect, or you can do something that is going to be that would resonate with you, that you can enjoy. Because if you enjoy what you're studying, you're going to be better at it than if you're doing it just because you think you need to. So Russell, I'd say for either, I'd say focus on what you think is good, and you will have those opportunities, if not immediately, but certainly in the midterm or longer term.
Yeah, and I think especially if you want to go towards a PhD that's got a genetic focus, there are so many ways at this point in time to pull genetics into anything that you want to be doing. You can go pure genetics, or you can really go something else that has a genetic sort of attribute to it or characteristic to it. You have a lot of breadth of choices, I think.
Very good, thank you. Okay, do you think leadership is something you were always good at or something you developed over time? And what do you suggest that students do to be better leaders in the sciences?
That's a terrific question.
And really good question.
And a challenging one, because I think, when I was starting out, I really felt like as long as I did good science, I didn't need to worry about anything else, like my awkward personality. I could just focus on my science and that would speak for itself. And that's definitely not the case. You do need to have people skills. You need to have good communication skills, particularly good communication skills. You need to be able to think a lot about your audience. I find having mentors really help. I take those classes that how do you network, those kinds of things. It may not feel like it's a solid science class, but I think it's pretty important to develop those skills, to create that network and learn from each other, and take as many of those sort of leadership classes, or just ask people who you think are doing a good job of it to help you.
That's a good question. I'm trying to figure out, how do you teach leadership? And I think that's a tough one, but you said something that resonates with me, and what I would often tell many of my students and people that I work with is, you can keep your head in the hood and you can come up with a cure for cancer. If nobody knows about it, it's not going to have the same impact. So you need to do the research, and you hit up the word communication. So I actually think communication is step one. So being able to communication in terms of keeping a good lab notebook, communication in terms of being able to put together a poster or speak to your community or write a patent or write a paper. If you can't do that stuff, people aren't going to know the great science that you're doing.
Yeah.
So, I know people think of leadership and that's part of this discussion, but I actually think you have to have the good science and you have to have that communication skills. And it doesn't have to be chest beating, look at me communication skills. It's, hey, look at these results. This is really cool. And this is what I'm doing with my team.
Yeah. And I think also being open to feedback and really being able to sort of integrate that is learning how to do that is not easy, but it really is helpful to growing.
So I see it looks like that we have just about a minute left.
In my last minute, can I just ask, it's so really great getting to be back at UC Riverside and getting to talk to you and hear from Dr. Nunny. What can I be doing? What can other alumni be doing to really support what UCR's mission is? And how can we be more involved?
Oh, thank you for asking. Well, I mean, one of those things is what you're doing right now is sharing your story with this group and being here and letting the professors know what kind of an impact they would have, inspiring the students. So just doing this alone goes a long way. You also pointed out internships. And so, when you have hiring, you have positions opening, if you're thinking about internships or even outreach, please think of UCR, think of CNAS. That's a good help too. And then I'll have to, the third one, since you asked, to consider UCR in your charities, charitable donations or philanthropy, I guess is another way of looking at it. So any way that you can give back to the students and reinforce what our faculty are doing and what our staff would be doing would be great. And so Tina, you're already doing all those things. From sharing your story to, offering potentially interns, talking about outreach, all those things, coming to visit the class, we'll ask you back again, all those things. So thank you so much for doing all of that already.
Wow, thank you. It's really a pleasure. It's great to still be part of the community.
Thank you. Well, at this point in time, 6:30, thank you all for your, thank you, Tina, again, for the time with us this afternoon or this evening. We really appreciate it. And for representing UCR, and to our all attendees and participants, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing about your successes in the future, and hopefully one of you will be the subject of one of our next Let's Talk Science events soon. And again, thank you all for attending this event, and I hope we can do this one in person in the future. All right, so stay safe, everybody, and thank you again.